Disruptors and curious minds, Mark Fielding and Jeremy Gilbertson at it again for another episode of Thinking on Paper. As I said, my name's Jeremy. I'm a thinker, futurist, builder at the intersection of music, tech, and story. Mark Fielding, jump in with a quick intro.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm a writer, and also, and I'm going to make this work, a forager. So I've got a good kind of link. So where I live in the French Alps, and the seasons here, they're a bit like a remote control in the day where you just press a button and it's the next season. They're really defined. You can really tell when they're about to change. And autumn has just about arrived, which means that where I live, it's foraging season and there's loads of mushrooms. Now, I know you're a big fan of emergent systems, Jeremy. So fungi, very often
Mycelia networks. Yes, sir.
I know you love that. So I'm reading a book this week called God, Human, Animal, Machine by Megan O'Goodwin. It was recommended by guest of the show, friend of the show, Elizabeth Strickler. Actually, she said I should read it. And it's about consciousness, intelligence, emergent systems, and how perhaps we are thinking about it wrong or right. Philosophies, nature, there's lots of really cool, interesting, and it's amazingly well written. And I think it's quite apt because it ties in with our guest today and the legal system around emerging technology and artificial intelligence. And I think you should read this book. You'd love it.
I'm in. This is like a little mini book club between Mark and myself that we
emergent systems and intelligence, AI. It's brilliant.
No, that's great. You had me at emergent systems, and for those that have listened to the show over the last 6 or 8 months, we talk about this give and take between hierarchical systems and emergent systems and how things get built and scaled and all of that. So I think that is super important. One of the things that I've been thinking a whole lot about related to AI and as a tool for humans. And we can get into this. Our guest is amazing today. She's been using AI in legal practice for like for the last 10 years. So it's going to be really interesting to get her perspective. But when I start to think about it, when we get into trouble, when things become, because authorship is big, right? And authorship and copyright, we'll talk about that today. Copyright being something that has to be obtained by a human, right? There needs to be a human element in that. And technology does things to help us, right? To help humans. But where is the dividing line between where technology helps humans versus doing the job of creation for them? So I start thinking of like back in the day, farmer would go down the row, like digging by hands and putting seeds in, then the plow comes, right? And then, the tractor and all of that. And where's the demarcation point? Where the human is no longer adding creational value. So again, translating that to the music side of the fence, if you've heard, I don't know if you guys have heard of something called quantizing. So Mark, if you're playing on a drum machine, right, and you're playing a beat on a drum machine and you don't have the best rhythm, right? Maybe your rhythm's just a little bit off and you find yourself rushing the beat, right? So everything's kind of rushing a little bit. Quantizing is a tool, an automated tool that allows you to snap the beats that you play to the grid of the session, right? So specific BPM, specific type of rhythm, right? So I start thinking about,
if I watch skate videos or snowboard videos, is that what they use to put the tricks in line to the beat?
That's more of a visual editing function, but this is more musical, right? So it literally grabs the notes and moves them so it would sound like you perfectly played them on the beat. So you start thinking about that, like how much of that is that an assist or is that playing the drums for you kind of thing? So anyway, a lot of the things I want to be thinking about, and another little nod, as I always throw these little nuggets out there, we've been thinking about systems like this, systems like AI since Gulliver's Travels, right? Jonathan Swift wrote that book back in, what was it? Like 1726, I think, right? And he had this thing called the engine, which basically would put collections of words together to create stories, right? So there is precedent.
Well, that was like that was Chat GPT essentially in Gulliver's Travels, like the self-writing books, wasn't it? That
1326, right?
yeah.
So anyway, just a couple thought starters. I want to make sure we give a shout out to our amazing partner, Ripple, WRIPPLE, marketing's on-demand talent platform. So if you're looking for someone to help with copywriting, with graphic design, with marketing strategy, and now we've got capabilities for Web3 technologists, AI strategists, the whole 9 yards. Dixie is usually in our chat. She's amazing, but Ripple's been a great partner for us as an added tool for you as a brand to bring in these expert resources. And as you, as a solopreneur like Mark and myself, you can actually have access to some of the great projects that Ripple is bringing in as well. So thank you, Ray, Dixie, Ripple. You guys are awesome.
Yeah.
Mark, do you want to introduce our guest and we'll jump right into the fun?
Yeah, let's go for it. We couldn't have timed it any better. As we've said, there's quite a lot going on in the American courts. There's quite a lot going on with the SEC and with some nice NFT projects that we may or may not be able to speak about. Kassi Burns, welcome, senior attorney at King and Spalding, I believe.
Yes.
Has a background in, let me just get this right, transactional law, eDiscovery, I'm not sure what that is, privacy law, data breach response, information law, and legal operations, which means basically you're in demand by everybody right now, I suppose.
Right. Yeah. It is an interesting time to be practicing what I practice. But yes, I've largely worked in litigation using technology, specifically AI machine learning for the past 10 years. So text-based, LSI, SVM type of algorithms in large litigation. So it's a very exciting time, like I said, but I want to talk about the book you guys were talking about earlier. I've already added it to my list of books to buy, because I find that reading books about this topic, generative AI, emerging technologies, it just gives you a deeper dive into in a more in-depth conversation than some of the more shallow, still meaningful, but I always feel like I learn so much more from reading the books. But it made me think, and I don't know if this is what it talks about, but about 20 years ago, I was studying abroad as a Rotary Ambassadorial Scholar in New Zealand. And one of the classes I was taking was AI represented in sci-fi movies. And and so it was like a philosophy / film course. And one thing that,
cool
that 20 years ago, we were talking about AI. And I remember one of the articles, back then we were just reading articles, no one was really writing books about it. And I remember one article saying the further we rely on more advanced technologies, like the more we anthropomorphize like animals. So like we get more and more humanly tied to like our pets and things like that. So it's something like I think back and reflect on. So I don't know if the book touches on that at all, but I found that very interesting. So I'll have to
It does. It does very much touches on that and analogies, and yeah, it does. She's a very good writer.
I want to poke that one a little bit. So the more we rely on technology to automate our processes, the more connected we become to like our dogs and cats.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Really interesting.
We get more emotionally like tied to them. It's interesting. And again, it's been over 20 years, so I don't really remember like what mechanism, like what is it about it, but it's definitely 20 years later, it's definitely happening. So we all, treat our animals as humans. So interesting.
It's quite interesting is like how quickly we'll refer to robotic animals, which don't really look anything like a pet, but like they have eyes with like round globes but you can very quickly in a matter of days start reacting and behaving with these robots as if they were your close companion.
Well, you remember years, I don't know how many years ago, but it was, what was it called? Tamagotchi or whatever. There were these little like technology pets or tech things that you take care of and feed and grow and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, that's a whole nother interpretation of that. Well, let's dive in a bit to your background, Kassi, because I think it's super fascinating. You hinted on it a little bit. When did you first come across and have a bit of an aha moment when you were doing a lot of litigation to where technology like AI could help you do your job better?
Yeah, it really is something that came along in a more broad way, and I was very early in my career. The aspect that I started off involved in litigation is called discovery, and that's in the U.S. It's a procedural part of civil litigation and other types of investigations where the parties have to exchange information to each other for them to build their respective cases. And as you can imagine, as we dealt with another technological advance with email and the internet, that world turned from boxes to emails, and the volume of it exploded. And I remember, and part of that requires an attorney to go through and look at documents and determine what needs to go to the other side. So that changed from boxes in your client's office to forensically pulling all of their emails and their desktops back then, or their laptops now, all that kind of stuff. And whenever I was first doing it, I was one of those attorneys just reviewing. I was very early in my career, and we were literally reviewing everything. We didn't use search terms. We looked at cached files. It was ridiculous. And over time, case law evolved. So there's actually case law about the use of technology-assisted review in litigation. So there is precedent there in the US about how can you defensively use it, and it's interesting because we've used AI in an adversarial setting for 10 years. And so what happened is over time, clients were like, this is getting too expensive. It's terabytes of data. And the technology advanced where you could use text-based analytics for maybe email threading or create deep analysis. But then we started using active learning or just technology-assisted review, where you have a subject matter expert review the documents, determine what we would call relevant or not relevant. It's germane to what they asked for or not. And then that gets fed into the algorithm, and then it predicts based off of a relevancy score, the remaining corpus, and decides this is most likely, this is least likely. And then you can either negotiate with the other side and say, well, we're only going to cut off until we get to a certain point. So like there's a level of math that has to be done. You have to track precision and recall, things like that. Or you can just say, you know what, I'm not going to mess with that. I'm just going to use it to prioritize my review. I may look at all the documents or have my attorneys look at all of them, but at least I know the most relevant are likely at the front of the pile, and then we can be more strategic with what we know we're going to have to review. So, and if you think about it, that is very much like our social media feed. So if you think of your Instagram feed, you think of your LinkedIn feed, you're really seeing the documents or the posts that are most relevant to you based off of what the algorithm thinks. So I, engage in social media. I have like a hobby skincare Instagram account. And a lot of that was just like me playing with the behaviors to see what behaviors are rewarded by the algorithm because of my experience using similar types of tools and technology. And so, because we use it in a way that, again, is adversarial, you can have to deal with motion practice, motion for sanctions and things like that. If you don't sufficiently document your process and have a defensible process, it's very well suited for some of these broader discussions about AI in the EU AI Act, the US AI Act that's being talked about. I know UK is talking about it. And it's interesting to me because it's focused on maybe, areas of use of AI that have been around for a while, but it's just gotten a lot of attention now because of the zeitgeist around generative AI. And there are some of us in my profession where we could be a great resource because we know what it's like to have to validate and stand by your use of the tool. And sometimes it's not a good use of the tool. Maybe the way you have to refine that tool to get to the end product is going to take more time than just to use brute force and do it yourself, So, and then there are other issues, of course, algorithmic bias, because the way I use it tends to be more company sues a company, and they're, usually it's like company documents. There's not as much of the issue of like the institutional bias that you have to be concerned about that maybe they're in, employment law related litigation, so sentiment analysis or something like that, or maybe how it's used, facial recognition if law enforcement wants to use that. But those are still some of the same mechanisms. It still goes to data richness. How robust is your data set that's used to train it? What are you doing to train it on the back end and refine it? What are you doing to validate the results that they're at the level that you would expect given or require given the way it's being used? So it really turns into a risk assessment, that feeds in well to the larger arguments or discussions about AI that we're starting to see roll out.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there.
Sorry.
No, that was
my first thought was I was thinking about not All the President's Men, like Erin Brockovich, all my favorite films of the past, which involve massive scenes of people, lawyers going through boxes trying to find the right paperwork. And now that paper trail has gone completely digital, and maybe those scenes will no longer be in the films that we all love. With you mentioned our algorithms that select our music and our social media feeds, which don't always give us what we want. They give us an inkling of what we want. When you're using it, I'm sure you're aware of that. So is this more, you're using it to identify patterns, you're using it to identify further exploration, you're not using it to decide the law, are you? Or is it, does that make sense?
It really, yeah, it's really kind, if you look at legal practice, it's really usually focused on two things. It's focused on the law, and it's focused on facts and how those facts intersect with the law to help decide an issue that's in dispute because of that law. And really what I do, my work is largely focused in the fact piece of that, because in litigation, you have to have your facts to help build your case that relates to the law. So really what my job tends to be more focused on is what facts are there that we have an obligation to send to the other side. So it can be, the algorithms we use tend to be, again, the LSI algorithm, it's latent semantic index. It really creates a very robust constellation of concepts that are interconnected, not by literal words, but by concepts. And that can be useful. It creates like concept clusters. So you can do, if you're getting documents from the opposing party and you want to kind of see like what documents do they have and you want a quick snapshot, you can run conceptual indices on that and get what we would call concept clusters, and it can drill down into layers of specificity. Whereas like what we do on the end to decide what to give to the other side, it usually is a fairly, is it relevant? Is it not relevant? So the more simple and a little bit more elegant from a workflow perspective, it's a SVM where it's like a vector base. And it's like, if it's on one side of the line, it's relevant. If it's on the other side, it's not. So, we also maybe use it to help with like deposition prep. But again, it's like a very like focus on the fact piece of it. It works very closely with the legal aspect of it, because again, like you're looking at the facts to build your legal argument. And again, it can be an element of a legal issue if the opposing party says, you didn't give us everything we needed, so we're gonna file a brief saying that you didn't produce everything. So that could be motion to compel or motion for sanctions. And it's a very like procedural aspect of litigation, the whole discovery piece. But it is increasingly very important, especially as data sources become more varied. Mobile phone data is becoming more and more likely to be collected, and people don't realize it. And it's, if you think of the Johnny Depp, Amber Heard litigation, if you think of the Theranos litigation, it was those communications between Sunny Balwani and Elizabeth Holmes that they were texting each other that becomes very important. So there's a lot of brief writing that happens that can have a significant aspect to the case. So I don't know if that really answered your question, Mark, but that's really how we're using it.
And I like that. There's in the British Parliament, there's a lot of people sending WhatsApp messages and text messages, which are coming back to haunt them. You see it more and more.
Yeah, I would say to anyone out there, if you're working in a field, you have a job and you're talking about things that are relevant to work on anything in the US, at least, if it's relevant, it doesn't matter where the source is. It's not just your email. And especially after COVID, I think everyone realized people really maybe are using text messages and mobile apps to communicate about business. So, and it can be a mechanism to really do some damage in court, where it's this thing called spoliation, where if you didn't preserve things like you should have, you deleted them. It can make the court in the most extreme way say, well, your case is just default not in your favor, and I'm ending the case now because you deleted evidence.
Quick question on that one. So say
Yeah.
Mark and I are working on a groundbreaking new technology, and we're communicating back and forth, but our communication channel is Snapchat. That's all we do. We
Mm-hmm.
just use it on
Mm-hmm.
Snapchat. So I'll send him a snap, and then he reads it. And then, the technology, the platform essentially makes it go away. How does that fall into account? Does that fall on the platform? Does that fall on us?
It requires some advice from your legal counsel. That obligation to preserve data, that obligation to preserve data in court in the U.S. comes in where there is anticipation of litigation. So if you two are communicating about something and it's just like standard course of business, no problem. But if it's standard course of business and you know that it's dealing with someone who may try to sue you or you may try to sue them, that's when anticipation of litigation can come in, and there can be issues with you maybe not preserving it. And there's case law that says, like, if you are continuing conversation in ephemeral messaging, messaging apps that self-delete, you have an obligation to move your messaging to an app where those messages won't get deleted. So, and unfortunately, people don't realize it until kind of after the fact. And there have been quite a few crypto related cases that have come out, don't have to go into particulars, where some of the evidence about them, it's communications in apps like Telegram. So that just shows that, I think it's just a word of, caution to anyone in Web3, not saying that I want anyone to be involved in any lawsuit, but if you're dealing with something, it would be unfortunate for a case to not go in your favor because you didn't realize the obligations to preserve data. So.
Got it. I want to transition a little bit to human authorship, right? Because we're at a very interesting point right now, and I hinted at this in our discussion in my musical reference of playing a drum beat and using a quantizing tool set to make sure you actually play on the beat, and how much of that is removing the authorship from the drummer, like how much is the drummer actually doing versus how much is the actual technology doing, right? And where the line of delineation. So we're in a spot right now where the government is actually crowdsourcing opinion, inviting opinion into to this topic. What have you seen, and what's most interesting to you to think about and track on that?
I mean, I think a really great resource is Professor Edward Lee, and he actually wrote a book that was published this year called Creators Take Control. And he's an IP professor at Chicago Law School, and he talks about like some of the how Web3 creates a great opportunity for creators to maximize the benefit of their arts. Like me, on a personal level, I see AI as a tool. I mean, ultimately, and I feel like there are very shallow discussions about AI in a way that it's talked about in a very binary way. Either something is human created or something is AI created, and that's it. But that's really not the case. It may seem that way now, but I think as we go, it will become more and more integrated and more subversive, and we won't really realize it's there. It's like the Internet of Things. That was a big talking point 5 years, at least in my profession. And everyone was talking about it, but it wasn't as present. Now it's very present, and not many people talk about it in general discourse. So I see it as a tool. I see it as nothing different than maybe the idea of Vermeer using a camera obscura at some point. There's some discussion that maybe he did use a camera obscura. Does that take away from his art in any way? No, he still was the one painting. You could even see Andy Warhol as the early version of generative art with his screen prints. And sometimes he wasn't even the one, making the art. He was having some of his, boys in his studio do it for him. So I see it as a tool. And I think that, anytime I've engaged with any image-based created tool, it's not easy. You have to put a lot of thought into it. How much less effort is that than me just randomly, pointing and clicking my camera somewhere. So I think it creates some really interesting discussions in our thoughts about what generative AI. I think it's a disruptive technology, and that's why we're reacting the way we are to it. And this is something that Professor Lee talks about in his book. Similar to modern art. Modern art was received very poorly when it came out. People thought it was trash. Even Andy Warhol, when he came out, people kind of looked down upon it, didn't think it was that sophisticated because it had more of that graphic art style because he had a graphic art background. He didn't have the traditional studio art background. So I think it's just the voice of dissent is out there because we're not familiar with it and there's a fear there. I personally, again, think it's a tool that helps people's lives better. Of course, there can be the risk for full sale, just junk content and getting thrown out there. That's the challenge, I think, with generative AI, is how much is going to get junkified. And that's going to be a hard thing to manage. I know I had read an article about how, like on online retailers where you could buy books online, ebooks, it was just getting really junked up with purely created with Gen AI books. And then they were using that plus bot farms to push them up in the ranks of bestsellers. So, that also as consumers, we're going to have a lot less valuable content there, that I think that we're going to want to go to the human created content, because there is a sameness that occurs with Gen AI or with AI, because what it's doing is predicting what you want. And I think when it comes to art, music, visual arts, we want things that surprise us. And I don't know if that's really where the Gen AI, is going to be great at. I think it's an augment to your own creative process. So anyway,
I think, I think super interesting and a good thought, because that's a theme that's been coming around too, is like, all right, if AI can generate all of this stuff, how much of a flood? I mean, we already, like, there's a stat that was done like years ago that if the three of us did nothing else for the rest of our lives but watch the content that was produced yesterday, we still couldn't get to it, right? So
It's
Kevin
like
Kelly talked about
40,000 hours uploaded to YouTube, like every hour or something, isn't it? You just can't keep up.
Yeah, it's crazy. So that's where like this idea of filtering comes into. Kevin Kelly, Wired magazine editor, kind of futurist guy, talks about these technological trends, and one is filtering, right? So is this where Web3 could come in an interesting way and kind of say, you have curators, you have people that are, maybe it's a token gated kind of situation, but are you seeing that as? Yeah,
I'm seeing conversations about that. I think, the use of blockchain to validate source as from an actual person, I think I don't necessarily think that blockchain is the answer to everything, but I think that there's a compelling use case. And I personally think, this is just me, my own, gut check. It's not a legal analysis or anything. I think people are going to be driven to that unique content. Because if you think of how TikTok blew up, it's because Instagram got so curated and so same. A lot of the content was just like very similar. And that's just because people were trying to please the algorithm. And then TikTok came around, and TikTok was very much raw, like rough, like nearly like Dogma 95 from the 90s, if you think about like the movie style. And people were drawn to it because it was different. Like it wasn't this over curated thing. And I think that our human tendency is to categorize and drawn to similar things, but then we get bored with it and we want something new. So I personally think there will be channels that are verified human content, and that will be something that people will go to for premium. And I could be wrong, and maybe that's through Web3, token gated channels. It could be trad Web2 platforms that they are only going to maybe prioritize content from validated people. I don't know, but that's what I think. So
yeah, I was reading the hearing from the subcommittee. I think there was one on Tuesday, and one of the topics up for debate was, mandatory disclosures for AI generated content, including the use of watermarks, especially for political ads. But I don't think we need to add that. We spoke to, I'm not sure who it was, Reed, maybe. Watermark seems to be a no-go. I mean, and if the government are crowdsourcing advice, I think the Web3 and the blockchain community is pretty vocal about blockchain being a solution for identifying somehow. Because I mean, other than actually, like you say, having human curated kind of overseers, almost like a Brave New World, standing in a room going, okay, this person is definitely not using AI, this person is. I mean, how else do you make sure that that's a reality?
I actually was listening to a webinar earlier this week from the Content Authenticity Initiative. And it's an initiative that's started by Adobe, but they're working with hardware people, platforms, so Canon cameras, social media platforms. And what they're trying to do is build in an extra layer of metadata that gets applied to an output, which would be an image-based output right now. And of course, metadata is data about data. So if you take a photo, it's a timestamp. If you are dealing in a Word document, it would have, you click on properties and it would show who the author was, last modified, all of that. It would be additional metadata that would be embedded in the document that would be locked in. It couldn't be overwritten, that might indicate. So let's talk about, like, you're in TikTok or you're on IG and you use a filter. You can see that there's a filter there, like, because it discloses what filter there is. So how much harder would it be to embed that metadata into the output whenever you kick it out? So there are some conversations going on about what metadata can be done. There are always going to be workarounds. That's going to be the challenge to it, right? And it's going to be more challenging for the written base as well. How do you deal with that? It's a huge challenge, and it's an issue even in court, where when in the U.S. and I'm sure all other jurisdictions, you have to authenticate evidence. Well, authenticating a photo, that seems like not a big deal. It's just like, yeah. It's going to be a bigger deal now, I think, because then you're going to be dealing with, has there been heavy manipulation? Is this, been deep faked, content? So, and even on the flip side, your comment about authorship, Jeremy, as things like Copilot get rolled out. And that's another example of AI is going to be so very integrated with what we're doing, and who started what edit first and who ended it and who refined it. How are we going to know that? There's going to have to be artifacts at the document level, I guess, that tracks all of that. So there could be a case where someone's being, testifying and being asked about a document, and they could say, well, actually, I didn't write that. It was just from our prompt. So it's just going to create a lot of interesting challenges, but there are really smart people that I think were very interested in this and trying to figure out how to solve it. So,
yes. So speaking of the challenges, I'm gonna point back to 1726, Gulliver's Travels, the engine, right? So if we picture this engine, this device that has, inputs and outputs, right? What is the legal industry think tank community at large thinking about if we simplify it like that, right? So if we control authorship on the inputs and permissions to use those, and then joint shared ownership in the outputs, is that one of the main things we need to focus on? Or do you think that would alleviate some of the concerns?
That might be. I don't really see that level of discussion happening. And in the legal world, it's interesting. And I want to take it out even a little bit further and just talk about the legal world generally. I think the legal community is interested, intrigued in it, but also I would say the legal profession is not known for being super, super, super technologically advanced. There's an area of law that I practice that does use, analytics, but not everyone's like that. So I think that there's a lack of understanding of how these tools work. I think that there's a level of education that needs to happen for a lot of people, not just the legal profession. I think even just like the broader discussion of how AI is used, I think it's seen as this great, godlike type of a tool, but type of a thing beyond, omnipresent. And I think if we really just simplify it and make it very practical, human in the loop is a phrase that's used all the time. I personally don't like it. I really think it should be AI in the loop. It really is elevating the role of AI in a way that I think it should be flipped. It's a tool that's used that should make our lives easier, do things that we've done in the past and we've organized in the past. It's a mirror, it's a reflection of how we like to organize and do things. It can just do it faster because now we're using so much more electronic data sources. It can do it more efficiently than us. And there are going to be some things that aren't as well suited to use it. But I guess to your point, I even just think the idea of authorship is an interesting one because we're using things like collaboration tools more and more. So there's not just one person toiling away, in the back writing a book. There may be people collaborating together. So I don't know. It's all like a very fascinating topic for sure. What do you think, Jeremy?
I think pointing to I always think about like the point of delineation of like how much is it? All right, is it me pushing a button on something that the inputs are are pulled into the machine nefariously, right? There's no
Mhm.
negotiation. There's no, like there's a lot of legal cases happening right now where people are claiming that their books, their writing, their authorship have been used to train something else, right?
Mhm.
So if I'm pushing one button and having an output come from these inputs that haven't been, the creators haven't said okay
Mhm.
to having them be used in the system like this, I think that's a big problem, right?
Right.
And me pushing something out just by pushing a button, having no kind of curatorial artistic flavor on top of that, I'm just mashing a button, right? I think there needs to be a way to control those inputs and outputs, and that's where I kind of think about it. I mean, I think the tool could be great to use, like, but it needs to be, what comes in needs to be agreed upon and also assigned attribution on the way out, right?
Right. I think, and that's where the transparency, I think, becomes very important, where knowing where those sources came from and the output, what sources maybe contributed to that. And I would argue that the more rich that data source is coming from, the less likely it is to be like a wholesale, you know, copy of it. It's less transformative. Or if the person typing in, I want a song that sounds exactly like Jeremy Gilbertson's song, but just, that to me is a sign of intent to infringe. You're using this tool to make it, so I
Right.
think,
And to inform that tool, someone grabbed my catalog to train it on, what I do and how I do it. So that's kind of scary.
And
yeah, I think,
how do you back up on that? Because sorry, Jane, but your songs have already been uploaded, so that it's too late
how do
for
you unring
the
the
back
bell?
cat. Yeah,
Mhm.
can
Mm.
you? I don't know if you can. Maybe going forward, we need something in place, some kind of legislation to stop the next generation of culture from
Mhm.
going down the same path as Jeremy's hit parade.
Yeah, I think, again, I think these are all like really good points. And I think, again, these are all fact-based discussions. And unfortunately, the challenge to it, if we don't get legislation that can streamline some of it, maybe not all of it, the fact that it's a very fact intensive discussion of, is something even copyright protected, and then it's going to turn into, was there copyright infringement? So I could see the inputs that were used to create the thing being very important in copyright litigation. So, where can we strike a reasonable balance where the creators who created something are getting, they're getting the credit, or they're getting maybe royalties paid out or something like that, and then the people who are using these tools in a way that really is adding richness, they're using it in an authored way where they're really being thoughtful about it, spending an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours really refining the output to something in their head that they think should go out the door. How do we give them the right to benefit from that? So, I think a lot of people do see it as just like someone pushing a button, but I do think that there are some people using Gen AI tools that they're putting a lot of time and effort into
Yeah.
it, way more than, again, me just like breaking out my smartphone and taking a camera with my phone, which does use AI. Our phones, of course, our camera phones have AI embedded in it. And that's another example of the very subversive use of AI. It doesn't capture anyone's attention. There were articles that came out, I think, last year of, some cameras, if you take a picture of a moon very highly zoomed in, that photo is largely assisted and edited by AI machine learning. So how is that more protected than someone who spent 4 or 5 hours crafting images through Midjourney?
Well, balance is key, I think, like what you mentioned before. So I'm going to stay in the music lane just because it's a relatable, for most people, and it's kind of where my head goes originally. So Mark has this platform. It's an AI platform that allow people to put inputs in there. All the attribution is set up, but it allows people to push buttons and create new outputs. So even though creativity is the unique arrangement of found elements in a sense, right? I can't like pull my guitar up and record myself playing a C major chord and be like, Mark, that's my asset, right? No
Right,
one can own a C major chord,
right.
right? But if I create a unique enough interpretation of the performance of that, then maybe we're interested, or maybe there's a way to kind of say, well, that's pretty unique. How do we find the balance? So, and how does an attorney, how does an attorney like look at that and say, this is unique or not unique?
I think that there's case law that's around that in copyright law. Is it transformative enough? Is fair use in play? And there are multiple prongs to fair use, which, of course, with the Andy Warhol case that came out, that the timing of that case coming out with Gen AI kind of blowing up, that was very focused on, screen print art from a long time ago, but what potential impact will it have to these broader discussions? It's just anyone's guess, but I think it's a very good time to be an IP attorney, to be honest. And unfortunately, it's a hard time, I think, to be an artist. If you're dabbling in these new tools, you want to use it and know that your rights being protected and that you're not going to be, have infringement claims brought against you. It's probably similar to maybe something that the music industry dealt with when rap became more prevalent and there was sampling, stuff like that going on. So, and similar, again, that was often an analysis of fair use or, whether copyright infringement fall out. So
3 Feet High and Rising took 30 years to get to the bottom of that legislative copyright black hole, didn't it? De La Soul's album. So legislation, I don't know what. Speaking of legislation, I'm coming from the UK. I know America. You said that America, UK, and Europe are always all working on legislation. An interesting question. So, in the crypto world, we hear a lot about legislation. We hear a lot about the SEC. Is there a competitive angle within the industry whereby you want to have some legislation before another country? Does America want to lead this? Is there a desire to get something sorted before Europe or before other countries?
I mean, I don't want to be speaking for all of America, but I do think that we're seeing it in how some legislation, as you mentioned, they're responding differently to crypto, and there are different positions across the board, which is interesting. The U.S. Copyright Office has come out pretty strongly right out of the bat, but it's taken a very hardline position, and I'm encouraged by the fact that they're asking for comments. Of course, this isn't the first time they asked for comments. They had hearings earlier in the year. The fact that they're opening it very broadly, and for anyone in the audience, it doesn't have to be just be an attorney that submits comments, and check it out, look into it. If you feel really compelled, maybe collab with some people and submit your thoughts, because I think it's very interesting and important, not just from a legal perspective, to have voice to the Copyright Office. People who are artists as well should, and I think the fact that they're taking time to hear from people is very encouraging. I think they're being cautious because attorneys are cautious people. We're risk averse. So I think it's easier to be very strict on the front end and then be thoughtful about the scale out. And I would say, we're talking about a much larger issue of just data management and data integrity. And there's a lot of data heavy elements to all of this. That
data permissions too. Sorry to jump in here, but data permissions as well, right? Yeah.
So I think UK's House of Commons sent a request to the government to say we need to readdress the text and data scraping, laws. And so how that's all going to play out, I feel that it's really all highlighting, it's a catalyst for a conversation of how important data and content is. We've been creating data points and we've been creating content online for a long time. And there are some companies that have built very robust, powerful business models off of it. And I think with Gen AI coming out, it's really causing people to pump the brakes and say, wait, let's think about this and how can we use it and what's fair and what's equitable. And I think it's great that that's happening. And I would guess that social media is helping drive these discussions further. Before, whenever the internet first came on, that was probably a discussion that was very limited in who was involved in that, because we didn't have social media outlets. We didn't have people talking about it on TikTok. We didn't have people talking about it on LinkedIn. It's a much more informed public, and also it's more accessible to get your message out there. So I think it's a great opportunity, and there are a lot of smart people in this world. I think we can come up with some great solutions. I don't think that we're going to be able to fix all of the problems, but if we can find in that middle ground, that balance for the majority of people acting in good faith, I think that, we'll get over this pain point of a disruptive technology and move forward. So I think it's a great opportunity, honestly.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah, and we've had some interesting talks. Last week we had a guy named Charlie Northrup on that was, probably one of our most fun episodes. Just he's reinventing this
The world.
concept of it's not building something upon the internet, but it's kind of creating a new version of a connected network that uses the internet and other things as resources, and you data points are things in that network, and there are a lot of AI assistant tools kind of coming out, right? I mean, Grammarly's been out forever,
Right.
right? Right. So that's one instantly that, the subversive side of that, it wasn't really big AI forward, but I bet a lot of people have used Grammarly before they, send a reporter an email or something, right? So there's that. But then we're navigating to like the next phase of this thing where the three of us have spun up our own AI assistant that we train based on the books we're reading, the talks we're having, and all of that kind of stuff. For people that are listening right now, and we're not going to call this official legal advice, but what are some of the considerations that that people who haven't really dipped their toes into this and are starting to see these tools pop out, but are a little like apprehensive to dig into them? What sort of things would you consider or would you tell them to consider as they evaluate them?
I think jump in and play. Don't be intimidated by it. It's a safe space. I would say it's probably going to be a little bit more challenging, or you may not get that perfect pristine output initially. And I think that's where we're going to see that trough of disillusionment, where, that hype cycle, because people have been talking about how it's either it's great or it's horrible. And the people who are great, I spent 5 minutes on ChatGPT, now I make $1 million off of my business or something like that. It's talked about. But I know I use AI in a lot of little bitty pieces, but it's all a little bitty disparate pieces that I still have to go from this app into this app into this app. And it's not easy, quick, and seamless. It's still better than doing it all by hand. But I think just giving people that level of expectation of there is going to be time, like you may play around with it and not like it. But you have to spend time working at it. Go follow people that give really good, meaningful information on kind of like prompt engineering, not just a really cursory thing. And I would say play around with things that are low risk. If it's or something that you're not going to, it's not going to be so close to the final output. So I think a lot of people have writer's block when they see a blank page, and they just might need something like ChatGPT to help them come out with an outline, and then they can roll with it. So I think like just being aware of that can help kickstart some of the things you have to do. And again, I would play with it in a way that makes sense to what you're doing, and just always trust but verify. Always verify. There was a bit of a brouhaha in the legal world where an attorney used ChatGPT to write a brief, and it hallucinated cases, like just straight up made them up, right? And he thought it was just like Google search. And the opposing party came over and said, I can't find these cases. What's up with that? And he was just like, well, I swear. And so he had ChatGPT, like, did you tell me the truth? And ChatGPT was like, yeah, I totally told you the truth. So he had sanctions filed against him, like really massive sanctions. It was bad. And
But there are stories of ChatGPT passing the bar in other
Right.
as well.
So I think being aware of how these tools may work well. They work really well in those test situations. When you're writing content, it may just make things up. So being aware that things could be made up, and you still need to validate. If you're a subject matter expert of something and you're asking it to do something more robust, and you can actually catch the mistakes, I don't use it to draft your legal contracts and just roll with it. If you're not an attorney, of course I wouldn't recommend doing that anyway. But I think just being aware of where your area of knowledge is, and let that drive how far you push the use of that, and always validate it. And I also personally think GPT systems are going to get more customized to specific people. There's a lot of junky content that fed and was used to train ChatGPT. So the output is not always going to be great, garbage in, garbage out, of course.
So imagine that it comes down to another human element of trust, right? So we're back to humanity. There goes gravity. We're in a spot, but no, it's really interesting. It comes back to trust. And if you want to, actually, we had a great episode 5 or 6 episodes before. If anyone's listening right now wanting to dig into AI and ethics, we had Reed Blackman, philosophy professor and ethicist,
I've read his book.
Dive into that.
I've read his book.
So. It's a great one. It's a great framework for sure. Well, Kassi, thank you so much for joining us. This has been an enlightening conversation. You have a podcast of your own.
Yes.
Tell us about that and tell us where people can listen and hear more from you.
Yeah. So it's called Kassi and it's just really, and I end up talking to people about technology that I meet on LinkedIn. We strike up a conversation and I thought, why don't I just turn this into a podcast? And there is often a legal element to it. It's not all legal people, but I really want to have real discussions with people about how they're engaging in technology. So my first guest was my college roommate, who's an English professor at a university. So hearing that, you can go to my LinkedIn profile and there's a link in my profile page to the RSS feed. So you can go and listen to episodes. I just released my 20th. So yeah, that's where you can find me. Thank you for the shout out for that.
Amazing. We'll definitely be checking it out
as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, Kassi, we usually have a good amount of comments kind of in the chat thread. We got one late from Charlie, who was our guest last week. We don't have time to dig into that question, but if you have time, I would love you to jump on that LinkedIn thread and check that out and see what comes out of that. We have some fun conversations after the show.
Yeah, absolutely. I will do that. So I have thoughts and things I want to play around with.
Beautiful. Well, thanks again to our amazing sponsor, Ripple with a W, marketing's on-demand talent platform. They work with large brands like Delta, Equifax, AT&T, and others. And if you're a solopreneur, freelancer with an amazing superpower, looking for another well of opportunities that are qualified with some great projects, check them out. Dixie's usually in the chat, WRIPPLE.com. Mark Fielding, closing thoughts, sir.
I'm very pessimistic about a lot of this at the moment. Just this week, I don't know. Maybe it's the season's changing, but I'm just worried about.
Leave it to the Englishmen to take us down after we're just.
Like, what is a day to a large language model? I mean, what the progression is so freaking fast that I just feel like a week, a month, a year of Congress sitting around asking for what people's opinion are about what they should do about maybe possibly doing this it's just, we don't have that time to get a grasp on it. I don't believe that. And I think that we have to be, something's better than nothing to begin with, is it not? Because putting that bloody genie back in the bottle, we can't. And I think that's my concern, but it's just the time of the week. But I think.
No, it's a good thought.
Yeah. I think so too. And I think that's where, maybe, again, the content authenticity initiative, they're doing this on their own and they're really trying to get other key business stakeholders involved about how can we track this. So I think there are people out there working, because I think to your point, Mark, they realize it's too important, especially with things like elections coming up and misinformation. There are people out there working, and hopefully I'm sure there's got to be some level of back channel conversations going. So I think that there are people motivated to find an answer to this, and I hope it'll happen.
There's some big elections coming up in the next couple of years, both sides of the Atlantic. So yeah.
All right. With that, before we dive into politics, we'll take it a wrap. You can find us thinkingonpaper.xyz. We're on Spotify. We're on YouTube. I actually went out on Facebook and Twitter and a few other platforms live today.
Anybody watch?
I don't know. We'll see. Maybe one or two. We'll check it out. But thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks again to Ripple. Kassi, thanks to you for joining us. Kassi and her podcast. We'll put a link to it. Yep. Mark, great to see you.
You too.
We'll see you next week, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.